but not the.
All right, thanks folks for joining. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. So make sure you get settled in a little bit. I know I'm really excited for this talk, but we'll let some folks filter in. We do have a pretty large attendance today. So just get settled. We'll get started in a couple minutes. Feel free to mess around with Zoom a little bit, but everyone will be muted. Also, if you have your videos on, feel free to turn those off for now. We just want to make sure our technology runs as smooth as possible. All right, a lot of folks are just filtering in. So I'm going to keep admitting people, but for the sake of time, I'm going to hand it over to Kelly to get our program started. That way Arvind can present and have some time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to throw it over to Kelly.
All right, welcome everyone. Before we begin today's webinar, I just want to share a few items with you. As Tyler mentioned, we are using Zoom for today's webinar. If this happens to be your first Zoom meeting, please mute your video and microphone because it helps the technology run smoother, or we can do that for you. If you aren't already, it can be done if you just move your mouse over to the bottom of your screen and make sure the microphone and camera icons both have red lines on them. When the presentation is in full screen, your screen will also be. If you need to exit the full screen view, just press escape on your computer or click exit full screen in the upper right corner of Zoom. At the bottom of your window, you'll see the chat button, which is circled in green on my presentation window. Click the chat button and that should dock next to the presentation. When you see a message or question, when you want to send a message or a question, just make sure it says to everyone so that we can all see your input. We'll be using the chat window throughout the presentation, so that is there for you. All right, we would like to give a special thanks to Lauren DeRosa and her staff and customers at Wild Birds Unlimited Nature Shop in Fort Collins for sponsoring today's special presentation. Lauren is a longtime supporter of Bird Conservancy programs and is passionate about helping create bird lovers. Despite the pandemic, Lauren's dedicated customers continue to show their care and concern for not just attracting and welcoming birds in their own yards, but for overall decline of many bird species. One common concern from her customers was the sudden mass die-off of so many migratory birds in the American Southwest this past fall. Thus, we thank Lauren and the caring and concerned bird lovers for inspiring today's presentation and for your passion to help keep birds abundant. If you are interested in sponsoring a future Bird Conservancy webinar or event, I'll include my contact information in the chat later on. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Arvind Punjabi is the Senior Research Scientist at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, where he works to conserve native bird species through an integrated approach of science, education, and land stewardship. Arvind has focused much of his 20-year career at Bird Conservancy on the conservation of Western North America's birds, especially in Mexico, where he has helped develop the science, partnerships, and local capacity to advance bird conservation in the country. Arvind also works closely with Partners in Flight to develop the scientific foundation and tools for coordinating bird conservation priorities across agencies and organizations in North America through his work with the Avian Conservation Assessment Database. When not in the field office or traveling, Arvind enjoys watching birds, playing music, and spending time at home in the hills of Larimer County, Colorado, with his wife, Susan, and their 2 teenage boys. I'm Kelly Hirsch. I'm the Development Director here at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And you already heard Tyler Cash, who is our Camp and Community Coordinator. He'll be our technical assistant, and also we'll both be monitoring the chat window for questions. Thanks for attending and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Kelly, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so glad to be here and to be talking about this topic today, even though it's not the cheeriest of subject matters. It is one that captured the collective interest of birders and ornithologists and the general public last fall, both in our hearts and minds, and moved a lot of people. It was widely reported in the media at the time, but there were not many answers available to explain what exactly was going on at the time. So I'd like to take you back to last fall and remind you of the sequence of events that unfolded and examine the various evidence that was gathered both by citizen scientists and professional scientists to try to determine what drove this unprecedented die-off of migrating birds in our region. Before I get started, I just want to make sure you all know who the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies is. We are a Colorado-based nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to the conservation of birds and their habitats through science, education, and land stewardship. And we implement these lines of work through an integrated approach across the Western United States and down through Mexico and Latin America. So before we get into the events of last fall, I'll just give you a little primer on Western bird migration. There are 3 general corridors across North America, flyways, if you will, of migratory pathways in the east, in the central plains, in the center of the continent, and then the west, in the western flyway. But within the western flyway, there are a few different pathways as well. The Pacific corridor funnels birds down, particularly along from the coastal mountains from Alaska down through California. And then we have the Great Basin Flyway in the middle, in the Intermountain West, and then through the Rocky Mountain region and Front Range and Western Plains. Now, in total, in this area of northwestern North America, we estimate that there are roughly 2.7 billion breeding birds in this area. And that information comes from Partners in Flight and their population estimates database, which we host at Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And that may actually be somewhat of a low estimate because much of this region is, of course, quite poorly surveyed. It's very remote. But a sure thing is that in the fall, there's probably 2 to 3 times as many birds, at least, as there are during the breeding season because of the young produced that year. So in the fall, we may have somewhere upwards of 6 to 8 billion birds migrating through this region. And that's a pretty significant number and important to keep in mind when we talk about the context of the numbers of birds found here. Another important aspect of migration in the West and fall migration in particular is that it is a much more protracted migration than the spring, beginning in July with birds like hummingbirds and shorebirds and continuing on through December with raptors and waterfowl and even sparrows. And although some of these birds may move distances during the day, the longest distances are covered primarily during nocturnal flights, just like land birds do in the east and in the spring as well. So I'll take you back to those days of September 7th through the 10th of 2020, when we had an abnormally strong and cold low pressure system and associated cold front dropped south across the Northern Rockies and into the Four Corners region. This was accompanied by freezing temperatures, abundant snow and rain, and extremely high winds with gusts up to 70 miles an hour. And as you can see, this cold air mass moved down from the Arctic through the Great Plains and into the Rocky Mountains regions, and settled right over the Four Corners region, where it remained for a few days. Now, by September 8th already, social media reports began pouring in on sites like Twitter and Facebook, especially from Colorado, but also across the Southwest, with people reporting finding dead birds in their yards along roads. There were many photos shared to these social media platforms, and many firsthand accounts that were also shared. There was, of course, a lot of speculation as to why, and people had all sorts of ideas at the time beyond the obvious, which was the weather. But what role might the smoke have been playing in this? Could birds be getting poisoned through smoke inhalation? What roles were the fires themselves playing in all this? Were they perhaps funneling birds into our region or disrupting the migration in some other way? Some people even postulated that it may have been disease or pesticides, or that these were simply young birds that were inexperienced and didn't have the knowledge to survive a storm. There was lots of theories thrown out there, and as often happens on social media, not a lot of facts to necessarily back them up. And there was also a lot of speculation over how many birds actually died during the storm. There were some of the initial reports estimated it may have been in the hundreds of thousands, but as the events unfolded, it seemed like it could be even more than that. There were also questions around whether the fallout and associated mortality of birds in September was related to events that were reported in New Mexico back in August, when there was no snowstorm, but mass mortalities of birds reported from New Mexico. And one of the things that emerged out of all this online chatter and discussion was that the Southwest Avian Mortality Project formed on the iNaturalist platform as a way to gather observations of dead birds and to begin to compile those, review those, and then analyze those. Some of the more quantitative estimates, as opposed to the largely anecdotal accounts that were shared on social media, came from scientists in New Mexico, particularly from at the White Sands Missile Range, where biologists from New Mexico State University, Department of Defense, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service collected upwards of 300 birds of over 45 species. And this included about 80 to 100 birds in the weeks before the September 8th storm. These birds included many species of warblers, sparrows, swallows, blackbirds, and flycatchers. And all but one of these birds was reviewed and found to be extremely emaciated. So it seemed like the primary cause of death at the time. There was also another fantastic report from Velarde, New Mexico, first reported on Twitter, but later followed up by scientists from the University of New Mexico, who found 305 and collected 305 dead birds along a short stretch of the Rio Grande in Velarde, New Mexico, which is just about 40 miles northeast of Santa Fe. These birds were primarily violet green swallows, but also a significant number of Wilson's warblers and a smattering of other aerial insectivores, other swallow species, and flycatchers. Again, all these birds were found to be very emaciated, and when they were weighed, on average, the average weight of a bird was 2/3 of the weight of a normal bird of its species. So again, it seemed like emaciation and starvation were primary suspects in this death. I just want to share this video to give you a sense of what it was like for the person who came upon these birds in Velarde, and just pay attention here to the ground, and you'll see how many birds there were at this site.
I have no idea.
See all the violet green swallows on the ground. quite unsettling. Now, I'd like to take you back to those days and look at the weather patterns that came, because it really was a highly unusual storm. So I think it's worth studying these weather patterns. And I want to acknowledge Brian Guarente from UCAR in Boulder, who pointed the ornithological community towards this website, earth.nullschool.net, which has fantastic imagery on wind patterns and air patterns in general over the whole globe. And so this first slide here is one day before the storm, and you can see that red line there sort of represents where this northern air mass was reaching at the time. Again, this is a day before the storm. You can see that that northerly air mass in the north there, and strong winds coming through the central plains, but hitting this area of warm, hot air over the Intermountain West and Southern Rockies, where there was smoke and extreme heat and generally little airflow over the whole western United States. It's also worth pointing out that a couple days before this, on the night of September 3rd and 4th, the Birdcast website that is run by Cornell Lab of Ornithology predicted a flight of upwards of 400 million birds across the United States that evening. These were birds primarily associated with this central region and in the east, but also across the entire country. So there was a major migratory flight happening just before this storm. And of course, that's the way it typically goes. Birds tend to move in front of these cold fronts rather than behind them, for good reason. Okay, so here we are the evening before the storm really began to settle into northern Colorado. You can see these converging winds setting up over northern Colorado and into Wyoming. Again, here's the line that sort of shows where these winds are converging, and this creates a fallout zone along this area. If there are birds trying to migrate through this, they might be riding one wind currents in one direction and suddenly catch another wind and pushes them back, and they will fall out onto the ground in those areas, literally. Okay, so here we are now at midnight on September 8th, the very start of the day, or night, middle of the night. And you can see, again, the cold air mass moving southward, and these converging winds beginning to take shape and move southward over Colorado. And again, this was likely funneling birds into this region, especially any weak or emaciated birds that were riding air currents with very little energy to expend, probably ended up caught up in these currents that were directing them right to, in this case here, along the Front Range of Colorado. So we'll go here now in the morning of the storm as this was hitting northern Colorado. You can see the cold front there. Oh, by the way, that dot you're looking at in the center of your screen, that's Boulder, Colorado. Again, that convergence zone of the winds now has begun to shift south over Colorado, southern Colorado and New Mexico, creating a fallout zone there in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, and that cold front beginning to take hold over the northern part of the region. Middle of the day during the storm, this is about peak snowfall in Colorado at the time. Again, that convergence zone is largely stationary now over southern Colorado and central and northern New Mexico, and which is the fallout area, and that cold front is now blanketing much of northern Colorado and Utah. Moving on to the evening now, September 8th, Tuesday, the storm still continuing in Colorado, the snowfall, but look at that area of winds now centered over central New Mexico. This is a very high intensity convergence zone, and there were 70-mile-an-hour winds reported in this area. And you see this convergence zone extends to the east into the Texas Panhandle and also west into Arizona. Now at midnight on the 8th, the cold front has pushed south over much of the region, and these converging winds and fallout area remain in over south central New Mexico and also western Texas, and again a smaller area of convergence in southern and southwestern Arizona. And by Wednesday morning, 6 a.m., the storm has largely subsided in the north. The wind and convergence zone and fallout zone has shrunk now and is limited mostly to southwestern New Mexico and northwestern Chihuahua. And you see already here, just one day after the storm, the smoke reemerging from the Cameron Peak fire by Fort Collins. And later that day, again, not much has changed with the storms. The winds have largely dissipated in the south, but again, the smoke already reemerging from the Cameron Peak fire after that intense storm. And so it remained. So it's pretty clear that extreme weather played a major role in this event. But what about these other factors like fire and smoke and drought? Were they also playing a role in this? Well, 2020 certainly was an extreme fire season like we have never seen before. There were wildfires in 12 western states, including the 3 largest fires on record in Colorado. These were accompanied by high winds that spread embers and spread these fires across huge areas. And some of this was driven in part by, or perhaps complicated as well, by the wildland-urban interface, which is increasingly populated and expanding. And that means that there's more things like electrical infrastructure and down power lines that can start fires, as well as more people living in these areas, recreating in these areas, and inevitably that means that someone is going to become careless, and that's exactly how several of these fires started. One thing that's clear about the fires is that they certainly displaced millions of birds from these areas. Through the millions of acres that burned, there were millions of birds that were displaced. Many of these birds were breeding there and had young, perhaps recently fledged. And the fires may have displaced these birds before they were actually ready to leave their breeding grounds or natal territories, putting them at risk for having to survive in unfamiliar areas. Now, the fires may also have interrupted normal migratory patterns because some of these areas of smoke surely would be avoided by migrants flying south, since they do contain numerous toxins that birds try to avoid, things like carbon monoxide. So it's likely the fires did play an indirect role in what we saw in southwest Colorado. There may have been funneling some of the birds towards our area, but that seems to be the main extent. But perhaps more importantly is what drove those fires. And certainly we had extreme heat and heat waves in 2020, and those came on top of years of drought and years of bark beetle infestations that created high fuel loads in our forests. And much of the region in the western United States, particularly the Southwest, was recognized as abnormally dry to exceptional drought, the highest condition recognized under the North American Drought Monitor. So this means that stopover sites in these areas were likely in poor condition. And that's important because birds that were coming from the north, where things may have been relatively more normal last summer, those birds need to stop over. They can't make their flight in a single journey. So they need to stop over and fuel. And sites in the western United States were probably in pretty poor condition from the drought. Again, these are primarily insectivorous birds. Now, we did recently hear on the results of the necropsy analysis from birds that were sent in from New Mexico to the National Wildlife Health Center in Madison, Wisconsin. And the report came back stating that the common factor amongst all the birds that were analyzed was that they were in poor to severely emaciated body condition, having completely depleted their fat stores on their body. They had shrunken or metabolized breast muscles, a sign again that they were very stressed out energetically and metabolizing that breast tissue just to stay alive and fly. They also showed signs of kidney failure and had empty stomachs and intestines, sometimes with blood, which is another sign of starvation. And they were able to rule out any significant impacts from disease, bacterial or viral infections, parasites, and smoke or pesticide poisoning. So despite the extensive smoke in the region, it appears that that did not play a direct role in the mortality of these birds. So what it seems like we had was really the perfect storm. That we had widespread drought over the region, and so birds likely arrived in poor body condition, and therefore it came with the winds and hit this extreme cold and wind and snow. This was the second earliest snowstorm on record for our region, so highly unusual. And it occurred right during the peak of fall migration. There were certainly tens of millions of birds passing through our area at the time, perhaps hundreds of millions across the broader region. And so that also contributed to this mass mortality that we saw. And then the massive wildfires certainly played a role in disrupting migratory patterns and stopover behaviors, and might have forced birds into areas that they otherwise wouldn't have gone. So how significant was this? Well, we may never know exactly how many birds died in this event. The ornithological community simply didn't have the resources and capacity to mobilize anything to go out and survey this area, these dead birds in a systematic way, given the time and how suddenly it came up. But it's probably likely that there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions of birds that perished in this storm. And so what does this mean? Many of you are probably aware that we have lost 2.9 billion birds from North America over the last 50 years. But maybe you didn't know that a large part of those birds that were lost come from the western forest region that you see in this graph on the right here, depicted by the Steller's jay. Birds in the western forests of North America showed a almost 30% decline over the last 50 years. So the additional loss of birds, and perhaps more significantly, the additional loss of habitat that has now changed from forests to now burned lands, which will eventually regenerate, but we're not sure into what, and it'll support some birds, but not all the birds that were there before. So events like what we saw in 2020 with the massive fires, the massive destruction of habitat, and then these extreme weather events that caused mortality, and the drought, which also led to poor conditions of birds. These factors are very significant for birds in our region, and we need to pay attention to the trends in what's happening. And I know it may seem hopeless given the scale of what's happening, and that this was largely, almost certainly, driven by climate change. I want to end on a positive note, reminding us all of what we can do in addition to voicing our concerns over climate policy action, just to remind us all that we are all part of the solution too. So you may have heard about the 7 Simple Things campaign that was launched in conjunction with the 3 Billion Birds paper. And I just wanted to reiterate those here because we can all make a difference. So first off, you may already be aware that cats are one of the biggest known sources of mortality on the continent. So keeping our cats indoors and talking to our friends about their outdoor cats and why it's important to keep them indoors is something we can do. And it's not only good for the birds, it's good for the cats too. Another major source of mortality that we know about and can address is window collisions. And While we often think of collisions happening on tall skyscrapers and with wind turbines, majority of window collisions actually happen at people's homes. So we can all make our windows safer, especially if we're attracting birds to our yards. It's something we should do. And there's even companies now that make these Acopian I think they're called bird savers, that are custom designed for your windows. Hang them on the outside. It's really not a big deal to have to look through. You start to avoid or don't see it after a short amount of time. And it does really work. Keeps those birds from hitting those windows. And collectively, that's hundreds of millions of birds a year. Another thing we can do is reduce the lawn area in our backyards, plant more native shrubs, forbs, and grasses, and avoid the use of pesticides. Keep in mind, many birds actually use plants that we consider weeds, and they'll use them for food, for nesting material. And so try to let your yard go wild and try to use natives. Natives will help provide more insects for the insectivorous birds in your yard, and also provide fruits and flower and nectar for birds that use those. Something else we can do is to drink bird-friendly coffee. And this gets us thinking beyond our backyards, because on the wintering grounds throughout Mexico and Central America and Northern South America, many of our migratory birds overwinter in coffee plantations, which are a traditional and widespread land use in the mountains. Here's my indoor cat. And it's also delicious coffee. So try to buy bird-friendly coffee. Look for the Smithsonian label. That's the only one that's truly bird-friendly. And enjoy that cup of joe. A challenging issue for our society in whole is the use of plastics, and we all need to do our part to avoid using these plastics in the first place. I know during this COVID age, it's especially easy to order takeout without necessarily thinking about what that food is going to come in. But talk to your restaurateurs at your favorite eateries, and let them know you want to see paper and reusable, biodegradable materials in their one-time use packaging rather than plastics. And let's see, finally, if I can get my slide to advance, there we go. Watch birds and share what you see. There's easy ways to do this. The eBird app, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. All the observations collected by citizen scientists and birders go into a shared database, and this information really is used to help drive conservation. And I use this data a lot in my own work, and so not only is it important data, but bringing a friend in the field and sharing your passion for birds will get more people to care. And before I go, I do want to mention there is actually an eighth simple thing we can all do for birds and conservation, and that's to support your local bird conservation organizations. We have a monumental task ahead of us to try to protect and preserve our native bird species and their habitats, and there are a lot of needs right now in this challenging time. So consider that in your annual giving, and with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining this talk and acknowledge our sponsors, Wild Birds Unlimited, and recognize the many people who contributed information and photos and videos to this presentation. So thank you all. And I would be happy to take any questions if there's time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that great presentation, Arvind. I know I always learn something from you, and especially when it is such a hot topic, and it's great to just start to dive into and understand what is happening. So we do have a couple questions that we'll just kind of go through real quick. And if any questions come up, I'll try to relay those in the chat as well. But we had a couple that were kind of based on why the birds were starving. And if we have any information that indicate if there's any low body weight that we've been able to observe before they even start migrating.
Yeah, that I bet there is information on that. People who were banding birds, capturing birds and getting them in the hand would record that information. So I don't have that, or I'm not aware of those data right now, specifically what they're saying, but I would predict that that bird weights were probably pretty low this year. And I think we could probably look at our own data from Bar Lake State Park last fall to see how weights of birds compare. Certainly, I think we had a pretty good season at Bar Lake last fall, which again might be an indication that more birds were funneled into our area than perhaps would have been in a normal year.
Yeah, that's great. We did have a good year at Bar Lake this year. Another question that came up, which I don't know if I didn't fully read the report that came out, but were they aging any of these dead individuals that they found?
I didn't see that mentioned in the autopsy reports, so I suspect they probably did, because most of these birds are pretty easily aged in the fall based on feathers. So I suspect, again, that information is there, but it did not emerge as a significant factor in the findings.
Another person was asking if how plastics specifically affect birds and the use of plastic.
Wow. Yeah. Well, plastics are getting into our environment in alarming ways. We are finding microplastics in our water. I've recently read a report in Scientific American that showed that most water sources in the United States are contaminated by microplastics. Of course, we see plastics in our oceans, and these huge trash masses floating on the ocean, and birds actually ingest some of this plastic. Birds like albatrosses, which have an innate response to want to try things that they find floating in the ocean, because in their evolutionary history, most of those things were edible. Dead albatrosses, these long-lived, slow-reproducing birds, have been found, on their nests with stomachs and crops full of plastic. So plastics are a real concern for birds.
Yeah, I definitely always try to encourage as many people as possible to try to avoid plastic as much as possible. It's not so much the plastic, it's how we, get rid of it, and, recycling and just littering. It takes a long time to decompose. Here's another great question that I'm curious as well, and we probably don't have a specific answer just yet, but do we expect to see non-migratory or non-native bird species filling in the niche left behind by these mass die-offs?
Well, I think this mass die-off, is probably not at that scale where it would create an opening for, new species to move in to areas that were previously occupied by other species. So no, I don't think so. Certainly, migratory birds and resident birds were affected differently by the weather and the climate conditions. The resident birds didn't have to put on a whole bunch of fat stores to migrate, hundreds or thousands of miles.
Awesome. Well, it looks like most of the questions we've had have been awesome. There's a lot of thank yous to you, Arvin, and I just want to echo what everyone's saying. So thank you, Arvin, for your time and to present on this definitely controversial and hot topic right now. We definitely love doing these webinars and reaching such a large audience. So thank you to Arvin. Also, thank you to Wild Birds Unlimited Fort Collins for sponsoring this event. They definitely helped us reach a really large population of people today. For those folks that are wondering, this is recorded. We recorded this whole webinar. We will have it posted on our YouTube channel probably by this afternoon, and Kelly will be sending out that link to everyone that registered. So if you missed it, if you want to digest some of this information that Arvin said and rewatch it, I highly encourage that as well. So if you have any further questions that come up, feel free to email Arvin. He has his email down there at the bottom, or email any of us at Bird Conservancy, and we'd love to answer your questions and promote conservation of bird species, because that's why we do this work that we do. So again, thank you so much, Arvin. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you everyone for tuning into this presentation. I hope everyone has a great day, and maybe we'll see you at a future program.
Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you everyone for coming.